The gavel cracked like a dry branch in a silent wood. Sold to Mr. Frank Miller for $3,200. The auctioneer's voice echoed off the tin walls of the county courthouse annex, but the sound was swallowed by a sudden, thick silence. It was the kind of quiet that follows a foolish bet, a collective intake of breath from the 50 or so farmers and townsfolk gathered there on that grey March morning in 1970. Every eye in the room turned to Frank. He sat straight-backed on a folding metal chair, his knuckles white on his knees, his face as weathered and unreadable as the granite outcrops on the land he'd just bought. A low chuckle broke the stillness. It came from Roger Davenport, a man whose ambition was as loud as his new plaid sport coat. He leaned over to the man next to him, his whisper carrying easily across the room. "Miller just bought himself the biggest rock pile in the county. Must have more money than sense." Frank didn't flinch. He'd known Davenport since they were boys, and he knew the man's character was as shallow as the topsoil on his daddy's bottomland. The realtor, a slick man named Henderson with a tie clip shaped like a tiny house, scurried over to Frank, his face a mask of practiced concern. "Frank, are you sure about this? We can still back out. The bank considers that parcel agriculturally unviable. It's 40 acres of nothing but flint, scrub oak, and heartache." Frank stood up, his movements slow and deliberate. He was not a large man, but he was dense, built of the same stubborn material as the land he worked. He looked Henderson square in the eye. "A man's land is his own business, Mr. Henderson. I'll take the deed." Henderson's smile was thin and sharp. "Well, it's your money." He turned to the room, raising his voice with a showman's flourish. "Let the record show, I advised Mr. Miller against this purchase. This is the parcel we call the Stonebreaker 40, for a reason, folks." Laughter rippled through the crowd. Frank ignored it. He walked to the clerk's table, pulled a worn leather wallet from the pocket of his denim jacket, and counted out the cash. Not a cashier's check, not a loan slip. 32 $100 bills, worn soft as old linen. He'd saved it for years, selling a few extra calves, cutting back on everything that wasn't essential. It was the last of his cash reserves, but the land was now his. Free and clear. No bank man would ever set foot on it with a foreclosure notice. As he walked out into the damp chill of the morning, Davenport fell into step beside him, clapping him on the shoulder with a heavy, false camaraderie. "Frank, you old dog, what in the world are you going to do with that? Can't run a plow through it, can't hardly run a goat on it." Frank stopped by his truck, a 1965 Ford F-100, its seafoam green paint faded and chipped, a patch of Bondo on the passenger side fender. It wasn't much to look at, but the 3.5 Tahoe V8 under the hood turned over every time, and Frank knew every wire and hose by heart. He opened the door, the hinges groaning a familiar song. "I'll find a use for it, Roger," he said, his voice low and even. Davenport just shook his head, a smirk playing on his lips. He gestured across the street to where his truck was parked. It was a brand-new Chevrolet C20, gleaming red and white, the chrome so bright it hurt the eyes. "You ought to get with the times, Frank. The government's backing farm loans at low interest. I just leveraged the home place to buy that new section next to the river. Prime black dirt. And I've got a brand-new International 1066 on order. Turbocharged diesel, cab with air conditioning and a radio. You're over here buying rocks with cash while the rest of us are building empires on credit." "Debt's a heavy chain, Roger," Frank said, climbing into his truck. "Hard to feel the sun on your face when you're carrying it." Davenport laughed out loud. "That's old-timer talk, Frank. You got to spend money to make money. You'll be breaking your back on that worthless hill while I'm listening to the radio in my air-conditioned cab, making twice what you are." He slapped the roof of Frank's Ford. "Good luck with your rock farm." Frank said nothing. He turned the key and the old V8 rumbled to life. He drove out of town, past the co-op, past the new houses going up on the edge of the prairie. He drove the 5 miles to his own place, a modest 160 acres his grandfather had homesteaded. The house was small, the barns needed paint, but every board, every nail, every shingle was his. He pulled up near the machine shed and killed the engine. The silence that settled was a comfort. Inside that shed sat his life's work, His main tractor was a John Deere 4020, a 1968 model with the side console. It wasn't new, but its six-cylinder diesel was the most reliable engine he'd ever known. He could tear it down and rebuild it blindfolded. Next to it was the old Farmall M his father had bought after the war, still used for raking hay and running the auger. There was a John Deere 45 combine, small and slow, but it put the grain in the bin every fall. None of it was shiny. None of it had a radio, but all of it was paid for. His philosophy was simple, hammered into him by a father who'd lived through the Dust Bowl and the Great Depression. If you can't hold the cash in your hand to buy it, you can't afford it. Debt was a disease, a rot that started in the ledger book and spread to a man's soul. He sat there for a long time, the smell of old grease and cold steel filling the cab of his truck, the deed to the Stonebreaker 40 resting on the seat beside him. Everyone in that room thought he was a fool, a stubborn, backwards-looking idiot who'd just thrown his life's savings away on a pile of rocks. Maybe they were right, but the land was his. No matter what happened, drought, flood, sickness, low prices, no banker could take it from him. It was a small anchor in a changing world, a piece of the earth that belonged to him and him alone. Now, before we get into the sweat and grease of Frank's struggle, the years of backbreaking labor and the whispers of his neighbors, I have to ask you all a question. Have you ever made a decision that everyone around you called crazy? A choice you made with your gut, against all logic and advice, only to have it pay off in the long run? Let me know your story down in the comments. I read every one of them. The first thing Frank did was walk the land. Not with a plan, not with a purpose, just to feel it under his boots. Henderson was right. It was a miserable piece of ground. The 40 acres sloped up from the road, a steep, rugged hillside littered with granite fieldstones, some the size of fists, others the size of his Ford's engine block. The soil that wasn't rock was thin, acidic clay, good for little more than growing scrub oak and briars. He spent a whole day walking the perimeter, his hands in his pockets, his gaze sweeping over every gully and ridge. At the very top, there was a small flat clearing of about 5 acres, the only place that looked even remotely farmable. From up there, he could see his own homestead to the west, and, to the east, the vast, flat, black expanse of Roger Davenport's ever-growing operation. The work began the next Monday. He drove the 4020 over, the big diesel engine barking its familiar rhythmic tune. He didn't bring a plow. That would be useless. He brought a heavy-duty box blade and a stone boat, a simple sled made of thick oak planks bolted to steel runners that his grandfather had built. The work was brutal, monotonous, and punishing. He'd drop the box blade, scrape a load of smaller rocks into a pile, then get off the tractor and load them onto the stone boat by hand. His back ached, his hands were raw inside his leather gloves, and the dust coated his throat. For the bigger rocks, the ones he couldn't lift, he used a long steel pry bar and a chain. He'd fight the rock for an hour, digging around it, jockeying the tractor back and forth to get the right angle, the chain groaning under the strain until the rock finally surrendered its grip on the earth with a great sucking sound. He dragged them one by one to the edge of the property, building a long, crooked stone wall that slowly grew day by day. The community watched. Cars would slow down on the county road below. He could feel their eyes on him. He'd see Roger Davenport drive by in his shiny new truck, sometimes stopping, leaning against the fender with a few other farmers, pointing and laughing. Frank never acknowledged them. He just kept his head down, his focus on the next rock, the next yard of ground to be cleared. One blistering afternoon in July, he met his match. It was a massive, half-buried slab of granite right in the middle of the 5-acre clearing he was trying to reclaim. It had to go. He spent the morning digging around it, exposing its size. It was bigger than the hood of his tractor. He hooked the heaviest chain he owned to his 3-point hitch and wrapped it around the stone. He eased the 4020 forward, taking up the slack. He throttled up, the diesel engine deepening its roar, black smoke puffing from the stack. The rear tires dug in, churning the thin soil. The chain went taut as a guitar string. The front end of the tractor lifted a few inches off the ground, but the rock didn't budge. He backed off, rechained it from a different angle, and tried again. Same result. The tractor was powerful, but the rock was part of the earth's skeleton. He was sweating through his shirt, frustration building like a head of steam. He made a decision he knew was risky. He would try to use the hydraulic lift to jerk it loose. He backed up, got a running start, and hit the end of the chain hard. There was a loud bang, not like snapping metal, but a dull internal pop from the tractor, followed by a high-pitched whine. The three-point hitch, which had been straining upwards, suddenly dropped. A spray of hot fluid shot out from under the seat, coating the rear axle housing with a greasy sheen. Frank immediately shut the engine down. The sudden silence was deafening, broken only by the ticking of the cooling manifold and the drip, drip, drip of hydraulic fluid onto the parched ground. He swore, a rare thing for him, and kicked the rear tire. He knew what had happened. He'd blown a line, or, worse, the pump itself. He slid off the seat, his boots crunching on the rocky soil. The smell of hot hydraulic oil was sharp and unmistakable. He laid a piece of cardboard down and slid underneath the hot machine. Fluid was weeping from the main pressure line, fitting where it entered the rockshaft housing. He'd pushed it past its limit. He was miles from his workshop, with no tools and a crippled 2-ton tractor. He walked home, the sun beating down on his neck, his shirt stuck to his back. His wife, Sarah, saw him coming from the kitchen window. The look on his face told her everything. "The tractor?" she asked, her voice quiet. "Hydraulics," he grunted, heading for the barn. He spent the rest of the day gathering tools, a full set of wrenches, pipe wrenches, sealant, and a 5-gallon bucket to catch the remaining fluid. He found a spare high-pressure hose he'd salvaged from an old combine, hoping it would fit. The next morning, he was back at it before the sun had cleared the horizon. The repair was a greasy, knuckle-busting affair. He had to drain the entire system, 20 gallons of high-guard fluid that he couldn't afford to waste, catching it all in buckets. The fitting was in an impossible spot, tucked behind the PTO shaft. He had to lie on his back, his arms contorted, dirt and grease falling into his eyes. A wrench slipped, gashing his knuckles open on a cotter pin. He gritted his teeth, wiped the blood on his jeans, and kept working. Just as he was trying to thread the new hose on, he heard a vehicle pull up on the road. It was Davenport, this time in his new IH-1066. The tractor was immense, a monster of red iron and glass. Davenport killed the engine and climbed down from the air-conditioned cab, looking fresh and clean in a new seed corn cap. "Having some trouble, Frank?" he called out, his voice dripping with mock sympathy. Frank didn't answer, just kept fighting with the hose fitting. Davenport strolled up the hill, his hands on his hips, surveying the scene. "You know, for what that old deer is worth, you could have made a down payment on one of these. Got 130 horse at the PTO. Could have yanked that rock out of the ground like a bad tooth." He nudged the giant rock with the toe of his boot. "You're working yourself to death for nothing, man. This land ain't worth the sweat you're pouring into it." Frank finally got the fitting to catch. He began to tighten it, one painful quarter turn at a time. "It's my sweat to give, Roger." "Suit yourself," Davenport shrugged. "Some of us prefer to work smarter, not harder." He walked back to his tractor, climbed into his quiet cab, and drove away, leaving Frank alone in the silence, covered in grease and his own blood, with a broken tractor on a worthless piece of land. The years that followed were a slow grind. Frank eventually cleared those 5 acres at the top of the hill. He built up the soil with manure from his small herd of cattle and planted it in alfalfa. The yields were meager, barely enough to be worth the effort, but it was something. The stone wall he built grew to be 4 feet high and stretched nearly a quarter-mile long. It became a local landmark, a monument to what everyone called Miller's Folly. The rest of the land he fenced off and ran a few hardy beef cows on, who seemed to do all right picking through the scrub. He wasn't losing money, but he certainly wasn't getting rich. Then, around 1973, things began to change. The world woke up hungry. A massive grain deal with the Soviet Union sent commodity prices into the stratosphere. Corn went from $1 a bushel to 3, then 4. Soybeans doubled. Suddenly, farming was a boom business. The Secretary of Agriculture, Earl Butz, was on the radio telling farmers to get big or get out, to plant fence-a-row to fence-a-row. And Roger Davenport was listening. The money flowed like water. Davenport, with his prime bottomland, was minting it. He used his record profits not to pay down his loans, but as collateral to borrow even more. He bought another 200 acres, tearing out the old homestead and windbreak that had been there for a century to make one giant, efficient field. He traded in the 1066 for a brand new four-wheel drive Steiger Panther, a green articulated beast that could pull a 12-bottom plow. He bought a new Gleaner N6 combine with a grain table so wide it had to be escorted down the county roads. Davenport built a new ranch-style house with a two-car garage. He bought his wife a new Buick station wagon. He was the king of the county, the embodiment of the new American farmer. At the co-op, younger farmers would hang on his every word, listening to him talk about futures markets, depreciation schedules, and tax write-offs. Frank, meanwhile, seemed to be standing still. The boom years were good to him too, but on a much smaller scale. His modest yields brought in more money than he'd ever seen. But he didn't change a thing. He didn't borrow. He didn't expand. He used the profits to make the final payment on his original 160 acres. He paid off the note on the 40/20. He bought Sarah a new wringer washer she'd wanted for years and put the rest in a savings account at the local bank, where it earned a steady, if unspectacular, 5% interest. His discipline was seen as failure. His caution was seen as cowardice. One afternoon at the grain elevator, while they were waiting in line to unload, Davenport cornered him. "I don't get you, Frank," he said, shaking his head. "The bank is practically giving money away. Land values are doubling every few years. You could be a millionaire right now if you just take a chance. But you're still tinkering with that old deer and planting that pathetic little patch of alfalfa on your rock pile. You missed the boat, man. The damn thing sailed and you were left standing on the dock." "I'm sleeping fine at night, Roger," Frank replied, looking out at the long line of new gleaming trucks and wagons. "You're sleeping broke," Davenport shot back. "My net worth went up by $250,000 last year alone. How about you?" Frank just shrugged. "My net worth is zero. I don't owe anybody anything." Davenport laughed and walked away, shaking his head. The other farmers heard. The story went all over the county. Frank Miller, the man who was proud to be worth nothing, the fool on the hill. The pressure was immense. His own children, now in high school, felt it. They saw the new cars their friends' parents were driving, heard about the vacations they were taking. They didn't understand why their father was so stubborn, so resistant to the prosperity that was all around them. Even Sarah, his steadfast partner, began to have doubts, though she never spoke them aloud. She just grew quieter, her brow furrowed with a worry he couldn't seem to fix. One cold day in the late fall of 1979, Frank went to the bank to close out his savings account. He was buying a new-to-him haybine and was determined to pay cash. As he stood at the teller window, he saw the bank president, Mr. Harris, leading Roger Davenport into his office. The door was left ajar. He couldn't help but overhear. "Roger, this new loan for the pivot irrigation system is substantial," Harris was saying, his voice low. "And with the way things are, we can't lock in a rate. It'll have to be a variable rate, 2 points above prime." Frank froze. The prime interest rate, the rate banks charged their best customers, had been climbing steadily. It was already in the double digits, something unheard of just a few years before. 2 points above that was a staggering amount of interest. "Don't you worry about it, Bill," Davenport's voice boomed with confidence. "Corn's headed for $5 a bushel. This irrigator will pay for itself in 2 seasons. Just draw up the papers." Frank took his cashier's check from the teller and walked out of the bank. The air outside was crisp and clean, but he felt a cold dread settle in the pit of his stomach. He looked at his own calloused hands, hands that held no loan papers, no promissory notes. He was free. But as he drove home, the image of Davenport's smiling, confident face, so sure of a future that was built on a mountain of ever more expensive debt, haunted him. The sky was clear, but Frank could see storm clouds gathering on the horizon. The good years, the boom years, ended not with a bang, but with the slam of a door in a faraway capital. In the winter of 1980, in response to the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, President Carter announced a grain embargo. The primary customer for American abundance was suddenly cut off. The market, which had been a raging bull, fell off a cliff overnight. Corn prices, which had flirted with $4, plunged back toward $2. The river of money that had been flooding the heartland dried to a trickle, then to dust. At first, Roger Davenport laughed it off. "A political stunt," he told everyone at the co-op. "It'll blow over by planting season. Prices will come right back." But they didn't. The elevators were full, the barges sat empty on the river, and the mountain of grain grew. The optimism that had fueled the 70s began to curdle into a quiet, gnawing anxiety. Then the second blow landed. To fight rampant inflation across the country, the Federal Reserve cranked interest rates to levels not seen in a century. The prime rate, the number Frank had overheard in the bank, began a relentless, terrifying climb. From 12% to 15%, then 18%, then an unthinkable 21.5%. For men like Roger Davenport, whose entire empire was built on variable rate loans, it was a death sentence delivered in the mail, one monthly statement at a time. His payment on the new pivot irrigator, the one he'd been so confident about, nearly tripled. The interest on his land loans was suddenly more than the land could possibly produce. The first visible crack in Davenport's operation appeared that spring. His massive Steiger Panther sat idle in his machine shed for 3 weeks. The rumor at the parts counter was that a final drive had gone out. It wasn't a simple repair like Frank's blown hydraulic line. The planetary gears inside the massive axle were a complex precision-engineered system. The parts had to be special ordered from the factory in Fargo, and the cost was over $10,000, not including the specialized mechanic who had to be brought in from Des Moines to do the work. For 3 crucial weeks of tillage season, Davenport's flagship tractor was a silent, useless hulk of green steel, leaking money. He was forced to rent a smaller tractor at an exorbitant daily rate just to get his crops in the ground. Frank, meanwhile, tuned up his old 4020 himself. He replaced the fuel injectors, set the valve lash, and changed the oil, all for the cost of a few gaskets and a Saturday afternoon of his own time. That summer, a drought settled over the county. The sky turned a hazy metallic grey and refused to rain. Corn leaves curled up tight like cigars by midday, the plants turning a sickly pineapple yellow. On Frank's land, the crop suffered, but his soil, built up over years with manure and careful management, held the moisture better than most. His yields would be down, but he would have a crop. For Davenport, it was a catastrophe. His new fields, the ones where he'd torn out the old fence rows and windbreaks, were exposed to the hot, dry winds. The black topsoil, with nothing to hold it, began to lift and blow, piling up in the ditches like black snow. His expensive pivot irrigation system, his great hope, sat useless. The river it drew from had dropped so low that the intake pipe was sucking air. The debt he'd taken on to increase his yields was now attached to a crop that was burning up in the fields. Frank saw him one evening at the gas station. Davenport was filling a 5-gallon can. His face was gaunt, his eyes hollowed out. The confident swagger was gone, replaced by a slump-shouldered weariness. His new truck had a deep scratch down the side that he hadn't bothered to fix. "Heard you got that Steiger running again," Frank said, keeping his voice neutral. Davenport didn't look at him. He just stared at the numbers clicking over on the pump. "Yeah," he mumbled, "for now." He screwed the cap on the can and slammed it into the back of his truck. "This whole damn thing is coming apart," he said, his voice a low, angry rasp. "The bank, the weather, the prices. It's a conspiracy to wipe us out." "It's a hard time, Roger," Frank said quietly. Davenport finally looked at him, and for a second Frank saw not the arrogant rival, but the scared kid he'd known in grade school. "You were right, Frank," he said, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. "The chain. It's heavy. God, it's heavy." He got in his truck without another word and drove off, leaving Frank standing alone by the pumps, the smell of gasoline sharp in the humid air. The cracks were no longer hidden. The foundation of Davenport's empire was crumbling to dust. The winter of 1982 was the breaking point. Land values, which had been the collateral for all that debt, collapsed. Ground that had been selling for $3,000 an acre was now lucky to bring $800, if you could even find a buyer. The banks, facing their own crisis, began calling in their loans. Foreclosure notices, once a shameful secret, were now tacked to the bulletin board at the courthouse like common advertisements. The auctioneers were the busiest men in the county. Roger Davenport's sale was scheduled for a bitter, windswept Saturday in March. It was almost exactly 12 years to the day since Frank had bought the Stonebreaker 40. This time the auction was held not in the courthouse annex, but on the lawn of the new ranch-style house Davenport had been so proud of. The yard was a muddy mess, churned up by the tires of 100 pickup trucks. The crowd was different too. They were somber, their faces etched with worry. They weren't here for sport. They were here to watch a neighbor's life be dismantled, piece by piece, and to wonder if they would be next. Frank stood at the back of the crowd, his hands deep in his pockets. He watched as the auctioneer sold off the household goods first. The new Buick station wagon, the living room set. Then they moved to the machinery. The Gleaner N6 combine, barely 3 years old, sold for less than half what Davenport had paid for it. The massive disc and field cultivator went for pennies on the dollar. The biggest blow came when they put the Steiger Panther up for bid. The giant tractor, the symbol of Davenport's ambition, looked forlorn and out of place. The bidding was sluggish. No one had the money or the credit for such a machine. It finally sold to an out-of-state implement dealer for a fraction of its value. Frank saw Davenport standing by the machine shed, his wife beside him, her arm linked through his. He wasn't watching the auction, he was staring east, toward the river bottomland that had been in his family for 3 generations. That would be sold last. When the auctioneer finally turned to the real estate, a hush fell over the crowd. All right, folks, now for the centerpiece. 560 acres of prime river bottom ground. We'll be selling it in 3 parcels. He started with the 200 acres Davenport had bought during the boom. The bidding was weak. A lawyer representing the bank made the opening bid and no one challenged it. The bank was buying it back. The same happened with the next parcel. Finally, they came to the original 160 acres, the Davenport home place. "What am I bid for the homestead quarter, folks?" the auctioneer called out. "The house, the barns, a piece of history right here." Again, the bank's lawyer opened the bidding. $30,000, he said, a lowball offer meant to set the floor. The auctioneer tried to work the crowd, but no one moved. These were men who were fighting to save their own farms. They couldn't take on another. 30,000 once, 30,000 twice, 31,000, a voice said from the back. It was clear and steady, every head turned. It was Frank Miller. A murmur went through the crowd. Roger Davenport's head snapped around, his eyes locking on Frank's. His face was a mixture of disbelief and shame. The bank's lawyer, surprised, conferred with his client and then nodded. He was out. The bank had what it wanted. "I have 31,000, the auctioneer boomed, his energy returning. "Do I hear 32? Silence. "Sold, to Mr. Frank Miller for $31,000. The gavel cracked. It was the same sound Frank had heard 12 years ago, but this time it felt different. It wasn't a sound of triumph, but of finality, of a cycle closing. He didn't feel joy, only a profound sense of sorrow for the man who had lost everything. While the lawyers and clerks prepared the paperwork, Frank walked over to his old 4020, which he'd driven to the sale. He reached into the toolbox he kept, bolted to the frame, and pulled out a heavy-duty tow chain. He walked over to where Davenport was still standing, frozen, by the shed. "Roger," Frank said softly. Davenport didn't respond, just stared at the ground. "I'm going to need some help getting my crops in this spring. My boy's busy with school. I could use a man who knows how to run a planter. I'll pay a fair wage." Davenport finally looked up, his eyes glistening. He saw the tow chain in Frank's hand, and his face crumpled. "Come to pull me out, Frank?" "A little late for that." Frank shook his head. "No, Roger, this isn't for you." He gestured toward the old Farmall M sitting in the back of the shed, the one that had belonged to Davenport's father. "That old M still run? I need to get it over to my place. Figured you could drive it over for me. I bought it too. A man ought to keep his father's tractor." He had, in a private deal with the auctioneer before the sale started, bought the one machine he knew held sentimental value, paying more than it was worth. For the first time that day, a flicker of something other than despair crossed Roger Davenport's face. He looked from the old red tractor to Frank, and he understood. This wasn't charity, it was respect. He swallowed hard and gave a single sharp nod. Frank had not only survived the storm, he had weathered it with his decency intact. The years after the crisis were lean and quiet. The county healed slowly, like a man recovering from a long illness. Farms that had gone bankrupt were consolidated into larger corporate holdings, and many families moved away. But a core of the community remained, held together by stubbornness and a newfound respect for caution. The laughter that had once followed Frank Miller had long since faded, replaced by a quiet admiration. The farmers who had once mocked his old-fashioned ways now stopped by his workshop to ask for advice on repairing their own aging equipment, unable to afford new. Miller's Folly, the stone wall on the hill, was now spoken of with a different tone. It was no longer a symbol of foolishness, but of perseverance. It was proof that a man could build something lasting with his own two hands, without borrowing a penny. Frank had bought the Davenport homestead not as a prize, but as a trust. He rented the land back to Roger at a fair price, and for several years, Roger farmed his ancestral land as Frank's tenant, driving his father's old Farmall M. The work seemed to heal him. He slowly paid off his debts, and eventually he and his wife moved to town, where he took a steady job managing the co-op. The rivalry between the two men was gone, replaced by a quiet, unspoken understanding. Life settled into a comfortable rhythm for Frank and Sarah. Their children grew up, went to college, their tuition paid in cash from the savings Frank had carefully accumulated, and started families of their own. Frank's son, David, came back home after getting his degree in agronomy. He had new ideas, but he also had his father's caution. He didn't talk about borrowing for bigger machines. He talked about soil health and crop rotation. He learned to weld from his father, and the two of them could often be seen working together in the machine shed, their heads bent over the engine of the indefatigable John Deere 4020. The world changed. The 1980s gave way to the 90s. Frank was getting older, his hands gnarled with arthritis, his back perpetually stiff. He'd started renting out most of his cropland to David, content to just keep a small herd of cattle and tend to his garden. He thought his life's great drama was over. He was wrong. One Tuesday morning in the spring of 1995, a shiny new Ford Explorer, a vehicle unlike any seen on their gravel road, pulled into the driveway. A man in a crisp shirt and pressed khaki pants got out, holding a briefcase. He introduced himself as a landman for a petroleum exploration company. "Mr. Miller," he said with a polite businesslike smile, "we've been studying geological survey maps of this area, and our seismographic data suggests there may be a significant oil deposit in this region, specifically under a piece of property registered to you, the parcel known locally as the Stonebreaker 40. Frank just stared at him, saying nothing. The man opened his briefcase and spread a topographical map across the hood of his vehicle. He pointed to a spot right in the middle of the 5-acre clearing Frank had spent years of his life clearing by hand. "Our data indicates a pocket in the Trenton Formation, right here. We'd like to lease the mineral rights from you. We're prepared to offer a substantial signing bonus and, of course, a 20% royalty on anything we extract." Frank felt a strange lightness in his chest. He thought of the auctioneer's gavel, of Henderson the Realtor, of Roger Davenport's laughter. He thought of the sweat and blood and hydraulic fluid he'd spilled on that hill, fighting rocks that were bigger than his tractor. All that time, the real value wasn't in the thin soil he was trying to create on the surface. It was locked thousands of feet below, in stone 1 billion years old. They drilled that summer. For weeks, the sounds of heavy machinery once again echoed off the hillside, but it wasn't Frank's 4020. It was the rhythmic clang and roar of a drilling rig, and they found it. Not a gusher, not the stuff of movies, but a steady, reliable reserve of sweet crude oil. Within a year, a single quiet pump jack was installed on the hill. It rose and fell in a slow, hypnotic rhythm, a tireless iron horse drawing wealth from the very land everyone had called worthless. The money was transformative, but it didn't change Frank. He and Sarah still lived in the same small house. He still drove his old Ford pickup, but the oil money allowed him to secure his family's future in ways he'd never dreamed. He set up trusts for his grandchildren. He donated a new wing to the local hospital. He anonymously paid off the mortgages of 2 young farming families in his township who were struggling to get started. His largest gift was to the community college, where he endowed a permanent scholarship for students of agriculture, with one strange condition: every applicant had to write an essay on the difference between good debt and bad debt. One cool evening in his later years, Frank walked up the hill to the Stonebreaker 40. His son David was with him. The sun was setting, casting a golden light across the valley. The stone wall Frank had built with his own hands snaked along the ridge, each stone a memory. In the clearing, the pumpjack nodded silently, steadily. "You know," David said, breaking the silence, "everyone in town tells this story like you were some kind of prophet, like you knew there was oil here all along." Frank smiled, a slow, deep smile that crinkled the corners of his eyes. He put a hand on his son's shoulder. "I didn't know a thing about what was under the ground," he said, his voice raspy with age. "I only knew what was important on top of it. I wasn't buying oil, I was buying freedom. Freedom from the bank, freedom from worry, freedom to sleep at night. I just wanted a piece of this world, no matter how rocky, that nobody could ever take away from me." He looked out over the land. He could see his own farm, peaceful and secure. He could see the old Davenport place, now being worked by a young family he'd helped. The lights of the town were beginning to twinkle on in the distance. The pumpjack kept its steady rhythm, a quiet heartbeat on a worthless hill that had given him everything. It wasn't just oil it had pumped to the surface, it was vindication. It was legacy. It was peace.